What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. On February 24th, the date that officially marks 3 years since Russia's military campaign against Ukraine began, social media users across multiple platforms pull out archival footage, old headlines, and highlight reels from just before the war broke out. Ironically, these resurrected clips are a grim reminder of how top Russian officials such as Sergei Lavrov, Maria Zakharova, Dmitry Peskov, and even Vladimir Putin himself openly smirked at the possibility of an invasion, calling it a ridiculous rumor spread by hostile media outlets. Americans, Anglo-Saxons, Ukrainians, and obviously foreign agents. Yet here we are, 3 years into a conflict that was once mocked as impossible. War has a devastating habit of turning scoffers into spokespeople for horror, but in some twisted version of reality, the same officials still pretend their earlier denials never happened. But these lies are nothing in comparison to the red line Putin crossed recently. He literally broke the criminal military code of Russia and apparently faced absolutely no consequences for doing it. Not surprising considering him being the untouchable person in his country, but outrageous at the same time, since even according to his own words, no one in Russia should be above the law. Unless you are Putin, of course, it seems. And so with entire regions conscripting young men barely out of high school and forcibly pushing them to the front lines, we need to examine how these self-proclaimed defenders of the nation exploit their own children for the sake of political agendas they once claimed did not exist. And by the way, guys, some of you, the original subscribers of the Russian Dude YouTube channel, you might remember we used to have the ridiculous Russian propaganda chapters in the beginning of almost every single video in the past. Well, I still do these chapters, they are right now just only on my Patreon. If you wish to see these additional chapters, some extra bonus content, please go ahead and check my Patreon, the link is down below. This is an amazing way to support my work because this platform does not take much of a cut as YouTube does, so feel free to go ahead and check it, the link is down below. Thanks so much for your support. Now let's continue. If we rewind the clock to January and February 2022, we find TV anchors rolling their eyes at any suggestion that Russian troops would ever cross the Ukrainian border. They threatened the idea as a silly rumor and the anti-Russian scare tactic conjured up by Western disinformation media outlets. Maria Zakharova, the foreign ministry spokeswoman, went so far as to joke about wanting to receive the schedule of future invasions from the White House, so she could plan her vacations accordingly. Her snarky comments turned out to be as hollow as they were arrogant. When the preposterous idea of war finally materialized on February 24th, it was anything but comedic. Russian soldiers poured across the border, igniting a conflict the government had promised would never exist in the first place. Eventually, the vow of no invasion gave way to slogans about saving Russians from imaginary threats, labeling Ukrainians with all sorts of slurs. It went from ridiculing anyone suggesting that invasion is a real thing, to ridiculing everyone who said that, "Look, told you, you were going to invade. How are you going to respond to that?" Well, apparently, they did respond by saying, "We did not invade. You don't understand. We just came to historically Russian lands populated by historically Russian people who were harassed for 8 years by not historically Russian people who lived only dozen kilometers more to the west." And yeah, if you say that we crossed the border and went to another country to do it, it's all just a bunch of fake news. Tell me how much Joe Biden paid you to say those things. Before anyone could fully grasp it, entire battalions were sent into Ukraine, and by the time citizens realized what was really happening, the Kremlin had already undone its own denials, without even admitting a single lie. But unsurprisingly, this was not the only lie the Putin's administration made, and it was definitely not the most outrageous one. Since the very beginning of war, Putin swore that not a single Russian conscript boot will ever step on Ukrainian land. I mean, whoops, I mean historically Russian territory that somehow ended up on another side of imaginary border. Same stuff. He said he will take it under personal control to make sure that something like this never happens. And almost immediately, literally in the first days of the invasion, multiple reports of conscripts being sent to the front lines to meet their end started coming through Russian Telegram channels and unofficial media outlets. I mean, obviously, no way Russian propaganda would ever speak about it or use them as an example of heroic kids who are ready to sacrifice everything for the sake of the motherland. Surprise, surprise, Putin lied. 3 years into this grim reality, families in places like Verkhnyaya Salda are still burying teenagers who were never supposed to see combat. 18-year-old conscript Danil Selyaev, born in 2006. Think about it, 2006. And killed in the late 2024 is just one tragic example of how no deployment for conscripts turned into an empty promise. His father Alexei is a veteran of the North Caucasus conflict and now serves as a local official. Over the last 3 years, he never posted so much as a single patriotic call to arms on social media, perhaps because he understood the weight of war from the first-hand experience. Yet, that caution did nothing to protect his younger son from being dragged into a battle that the president once swore would only involve professional service members. For a brief moment, it looked like the older son might be similarly doomed. He was conscripted and spent a year in the military as the war raged on already. But luck, or maybe a timely discharge, kept him off the battlefield. The younger son, unfortunately, had no such fortune. He was forced into uniform as a part of a subtle practice that recruits teenagers through deception, pushing them towards a war their own leaders once dismissed as a fantasy. Danil's death is not just a personal tragedy, it is a proof that the official pledges can be shattered the moment they become inconvenient. To make the situation even worse, it is actually illegal, according to the Russian Criminal Military Code, to send conscripts to places of danger. Doing so will make you face the tribunal, deranking, banishment from the military, and a severe prison sentence. At the moment of recording this video, thousands known and officially confirmed conscripts were eliminated in Ukraine. Tens of thousands were deceived into signing a military contract and sent across the border. And 0 military representatives faced even at least an investigation. These conscripts were either fully ignored, their names were redacted from KIA lists, their locations of perishing were changed just to make it look like they died on Russian territory, or their documents were plainly forged just to say that, look, he did sign a military contract, so everything is according to the law. Russian propaganda machine works hard to promote the necessity of the invasion, and it works equally hard to hide its own war crimes and wrongdoings. And okay, let's fantasize for a moment, for a very brief moment, and acknowledge that yes, out of tens of thousands of conscript cases, not a single one of them was tied to any specific general or officer. What a coincidence. But someone has to be held responsible, right? Right? Sounds like blame is to be taken by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Armed Forces, nobody else other than Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin himself. He is the highest military-ranking official out there, and when subordinates do not take the responsibility for their mistakes, it is always the role of their leaders to assume all the consequences. Except, of course, if you are in Russia and your name is Vladimir Putin. Then, somehow, you are above the law, both civil and military. While the Kremlin still insists it refrains from any large-scale hunts for new draftees, leaked reports and personal testimonies paint a very different picture. In the Amur region, for example, an entire recruitment system has been allegedly set up to prey on teenage conscripts, forcing them to sign professional contracts under false pretenses. Officers claim that if they fail to deliver a certain quota of new sign-ups each day, they themselves might be shipped to the front lines. This fear trickles down the ranks, creating an environment where conscripts are lied to or literally tricked into believing they are signing standard paperwork, only to discover much later it was a binding deal to serve in combat indefinitely. Because as you might remember, guys, Russian military contracts to serve in the zone of the special military operation are non-expiring and auto-renewing, and things like injuries do not qualify you for an early discharge. If anything, it will bring you even closer to the hottest front lines, because the regime wants to get rid of such people. I mean, their thinking is, why pay disability pension for 60 years when you can force such a person to assault Pokrovsky? And then there are cases where the signatures are blatantly forged. An act so outrageous that military prosecutors in Chelyabinsk region began investigating at least 13 fake contracts. 13 out of hundreds of thousands, so you see the scale. Obviously, the results of this every single investigation were that these results are inconclusive. And while you're waiting for the investigation to be completed, you do continue conveniently fighting in Ukraine. So it is no wonder some young boys do not even live long enough to hear the results whether their signatures were forged or not. Some of these forced soldiers are shipped into the war zone with zero official documentation, bypassing any standard procedure altogether. Something similar, unfortunately, happens in Ukraine as well. The most famous concept is the so-called bussification, where men of eligible age are sometimes grabbed off the streets and pushed into military buses, later to be brought to draft offices against people's will. But the Russian approach is more discreet. Keep it hidden, keep the numbers rising, and make sure not to generate the kind of footage that sparks public outrage. If the world sees no mass roundups, the narrative remains that everything is under control. Yet in reality, 18 and 19-year-olds are disappearing from small towns and ending up in POW interviews, sometimes with missing limbs, sometimes with horrible stories of seeing all of their comrades eliminated in a single assault. No one in power ever seems to pay the price. Instead, it is the young who bear the full brunt of this conflict. They are deceived, tricked, or outright forced into uniform, sent to endure horrors that most cannot comprehend until it is way too late. The official line from the Kremlin claims they are keeping the younger generations safe, but funeral processions for teenage conscripts prove otherwise. And it is not just forged contracts or shady recruitment tactics that show a system willing to devour its own. Even minimal protections like refusing to deploy conscripts have been steadily eroded. When pressed about these contradictions, government spokespeople produce very vague denials or shift blame to Ukraine's mobilization, alleging that Kyiv is about to lower their own recruitment age to 18 years old. The question here is, so what? How does lowering conscription age in another country affect you breaking the laws in your own country? If somebody punches another person in America, it does not mean that now people in Canada can do it as well and face no consequences, because Americans do it as well. Americans started doing it even more. But if that is a crime, how it is acceptable for Russia to deploy 18-year-olds who sign a contract they never understood or never signed at all in the first place? The disconnect between public statements and brutal reality is a hallmark of informational autocracy that learned a long time ago how to manipulate narratives while ignoring the actual suffering of its own people. Behind every carefully censored TV broadcast, there are families grieving over a child who went off to do this one-year service but never came home. Well, there you have it, guys. Please subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. Thanks so much for watching. See you on Tuesday.